Let's take a look at how to cut out and sew the seams when you're working with a striped fabric. Now, if this is your first time doing this, I would recommend a balanced stripe with a wider width. Right here we have a repeating stripe element, lots of different things going on, but if you want to take your first project and work with something that is a simple 2-color stripe that repeats evenly, that would be my best suggestion for your first project. Now to get started, you want to look at your pattern pieces. If you have any pattern pieces that are set to be placed on a fold, my best suggestion is to turn this into a pattern piece that is open, flat, mirrored, so that you can cut it out all at one time, not on the fold. Now to do this, it's super easy. We're just going to take a piece of paper, fold it in half, place our pattern piece right on top of that fold line. I have magnet weights here to hold this down. I'm simply going to trace this. Once I have it traced, I'm simply going to cut it out and open it up to place on my fabric. Then you're going to want to make sure that your fabric is nice and flat, it's laying straight, and you're going to cut your pieces out one at a time. So we have that new front, and what we're going to do is line up the top of the side seam with the stripe. So we're going to place the front first, and then we'll work to place the back and the sleeve. And then it will all line up with the same placement of the stripe. Now again, this is a repeating design. They're just 1/4-inch stripes, repeating 2 colors, so this is pretty easy to do. If we place this on here, lining up with a blue stripe right at the top, and then as the stripe goes across, I'm going to want to make sure that I have the same thing on the other side, that same blue stripe at the same underarm. And you can see I had to slide that down here because at first I was about to do it a little bit off on one stripe higher and the whole thing would have been crooked. So here we have that, and I just have my magnets again to hold this in place. And then down at the bottom, I also am going to want to make sure that my hemline is straight. Then we have the back pattern piece, and to do this, I'm going to flip it over for this first one just so that it lines up next to this. And if I'm placing these right next to each other on the same fabric, I can simply make sure that I'm at the same stripe for the top of the side seam and the same stripe for that hemline. And you can see here, we're just going to cut these out exactly the same, and then those stripes are going to line up as we stitch the side seam. One quick thing that I wanted to mention too is that for this design we have a straight hemline, and it's equal for both the front and the back. So the stripes line up and it lines up along the entire hemline. For a shirt like the Avery shirt, if we open this up and turn this sideways, you'll notice that the side seam lines up with stripes starting at the same stripe. We have 2 stripes alternating colors all the way down to the bottom of the side seam, but it's a curved hemline. So you just want to pay special attention with a design like this, that you have your pattern piece lined up for the side seam, but then also where it hits at the bottom of the front at center front, and then also where it would hit in the back, so that your stripes continue to stay straight and line up as you curve down on a curved hemline as well. Then for the second back piece, you're just going to mirror that as you flip it over, lining up that top of the side seam again with a single blue stripe, and then making sure that it's straight along the hemline so that you don't have any of the stripes shifting diagonally at all. Then with the sleeve, you'll do the same thing so that the portion of the arm when it's down at her side is lined up with the stripes. You're going to take that underarm seam. On this one, the sleeve comes straight across, and this actually happens to line up exactly the same across the whole entire neckline, as well as where the underarm would go. So we're going to match that same side seam there. It's a blue stripe that starts on this arm side seam or underarm seam, And then again, you'll just want to make sure that you have that going straight across the same stripe, and then it's going to be the same blue stripe on the opposite side. So then you'll just go ahead and carefully cut out all your pieces. You can do this with a rotary cutter, holding the fabric on both sides. You just want to make sure that you're not shifting as you cut. You can also take a marking tool, trace your pattern piece all the way around the edge, and then cut it out exactly on the traced line. And then you're 100% sure that you have this cut out exactly how it lays, with the stripes exactly positioned how they're supposed to be. Now let's take a look at also placing this on the fabric that does have that repeating stripe. So you'll want to think through two things: the placement of the repeat, and then how to position it so that we can cut them with matching stripes on the side seam and on the sleeve. You just want to make sure it's lined up. And this is cut from a person size shirt, so we don't have yardage to put these all side by side on the same stripe. So I'm going to look at positioning that on a separate area of the fabric to make sure that we have the sleeve cut out on the same stripe pattern. So again, with this one, we'll do the same thing. If I want this bolder section of stripe to go right across her chest, I'm just going to set this. I'm going to pick a stripe to have the repeat on, and we'll do the side seam starting on the first narrow stripe in this pattern. So the bold stripes are going to go straight across her chest, and then when I come across to the other side, I'm following that stripe. Just make sure that I have this positioned straight. That first narrow stripe on this side over here is my other underarm seam, and I check that down at the bottom to make sure that's laid out straight. And then we're going to do the same thing with the shirt back, and this fabric has stretched slightly, so I am shifting it a little bit to make sure that I really end up with this cut straight along the hem and along the top. You can see that it kind of is twisting a little bit. So we're just going to carefully cut this so that the stripe is straight, maybe not so much the actual grain of the fabric. So I have that side seam positioned right here, top narrow stripe, so I have narrow stripes and then the bold stripes. So as we look at the sleeve, we want that to be lined up exactly the same. So we're going to take that underarm seam, look for a section of stripe that starts with the narrow stripe. So as I slide this down a little bit, we're going to look in here. We have the bold stripes, the narrow stripes. I'm going to set this right here. It's a little bit too close. I couldn't set it there, so I'm going to come up a little bit higher to a set of narrow stripes, putting this right at the first narrow stripe on both sides, and then making sure we have that lining up straight across that hemline as well. And then we'll go ahead and cut this out, and we'll be sure that we have the stripes all lined up when the piece gets sewn together. Now let's move on to lining up the stripes and sewing them so that all the stripes match perfectly in the seam. So here we have the front cut out and the backs cut out, and you can see this stripe lines up all the way across before we have them sewn together. And then here is how we have a sleeve that also lines up with those same stripes. So for this design, we are going to sew the sleeve to the front first, and then we'll also sew the sleeve to the back of the shirt. In a regular t-shirt, matching up the arm's eye stripes is not going to be so critical. The part that's really going to matter the most is that side seam. Because the cap of the sleeve is cut on a curve, it will line up a little bit differently with the shoulder seam and the front and back stripe placement on the t-shirt. Both of these seams are two very short curved seams. What you want to do when you're looking at this part is just really make sure that as you have them lined up and you flip this open, that the stripes are matched up. You want to place your pins probably about 1/4 of an inch apart, lining up the stripes, and then as you sew, you can carefully pull them out just before it hits the presser foot. When you place your pin through a stripe, flip it over and make sure that that pin is actually going through the same stripe on the opposite side. This works really well when you can see the stripe that's woven through the fabric. So I have this right at the top of this very narrow stripe, black and silver, and then again on the pin, when it pokes through the bottom, is also down right on top of that same stripe. So I know those are lined up. Then I have this one right here. I've poked that right into that very narrow stripe. I flip it over, and again, it's right inside that same stripe. I'm placing a pin right at the top of the black stripe, and then here it's right on top of that black stripe. Once you have your seam pinned, then you want to take this to the machine with the largest straight stitch, which would be a basting stitch. So right on that seam line with a basting stitch, this will be the easiest thing to remove if it's not lined up right. So you stitch that down and then you flip it open, double check your stripes, make sure they match up, and then you can go back in and stitch just past that or right on top of it with a standard stitch length. Now we can go ahead and match up these side seams for the front and back, and you can do the pinning method where you simply set these down, make sure that you have your stripes lined up, fold it back and really look at them, and then go ahead and pin through both layers, do the basting stitch the same way. Or we can use some double-sided basting tape. I have some here that's 1/4 inch wide, so I'm going to tear off a piece and put it right into my seam allowance without stretching the fabric. I'm just going to stick this down and just tear it off. Then you'll peel off that backing paper, and then we'll go ahead and carefully position this stripe to line up right on top of this, the same way we would if we were pinning it, but this tape is sticky and it's going to hold the two pieces together. So I'm going to start at the bottom, I'm going to position that right on top of there. And then for this one, I'll just fold it open this way to double check. And actually, I'm a little bit off here, so I'm going to peel this off and start over. So I'm going to work with this stripe right here. And set that down. Look at it again. That looks really good right here at the bottom, so I'll just continue to position those together all the way up the side seam. And then you can go ahead and still pin this down, pin through a couple places just to hold that as you're sewing, and do the same method. Stitch with a basting stitch all the way up the side seam. And then on this design, we also have the underarm seam. And again, right here, these stripes are also going to line up and match exactly. Then once it's stitched down, double check, make sure everything looks good, and then you can go ahead and run this through your machine with a standard straight stitch or on your serger and serge that entire seam.